Hi, folks. So, like I said in this announcement here, I have been under the weather for the past few days, but luckily I'm feeling much better this morning. So I'm going to post this lecture video, hopefully in the next hour or so, for you to catch up on the poetry unit. If we need more time for the poetry unit, we can absolutely work in some more time. But I think we'll be able to play catch up with anything. So I'm going to go over some of the stuff that you have likely already read. But here in the poetry unit, it says that there are parts to this module. This module and this unit are going to be very similar to the fiction unit. So we will have an out of class untimed essay, just like we did in the fiction unit. You will have things to read like you did there. There are slides, there will be this video, some lecture videos, things like that. So it's going to be very similar to our first unit. The first resource here is a link, and it takes you to poets.org, where they give you a pretty brief little page on how to read poetry. There are some ads because it's a free web source. But this web source is really useful because if you have never read poetry before, like if poetry is brand new to you, if it is not something that you find easy to read, or you're like, poetry is just not my thing, this source is going to be really helpful for you in how to get good at reading poetry, how to interpret poetry and analyze it successfully, so that when we get to our discussion board and then our assignment, you will be able to do it as well as everyone else. And I have no doubt that you will. So there are some sections to this web source, like getting started with some prior assumptions that you might have about the poem or the author, reading the poem aloud. Much like drama, poetry is written to be read aloud, right? So remember, in the drama unit, if you watched the live production that I posted, you'll notice that it's a lot easier to understand drama when you are watching it versus when you are just reading it on the page. That's because drama and poetry are both meant to be heard. Poetry was an oral tradition before it was a written tradition. So much like in the drama unit, a lot of the poetry that you will come across might make more sense to you or might feel more right when you're reading it if you read it out loud or you have someone read it out loud to you. So the first time that you read it, or maybe the second time that you read the poem, it might be a great idea to read it out loud. Reading the poem aloud and reading it more than once is a great way to start to understand what each word means. If it is uncomfortable for you to read, or some words you don't understand, you can look up the definitions of those words, and then you can kind of start to parse out what each line means. What are we talking about here in this poem, and then poems are meant to be sat with. So that's why we have such short readings this week, because none of them, I think, are past like a page long, but because of that, they're meant to be sat with, right? They're meant to be read, then read again, and then understood. It talks about the line. So a line of poetry, it's a part of the poem, broken into parts, much like the drama that we read was broken into scenes or acts. Poetry is broken into lines and stanzas. And then starting the conversation with the poem, it says that poems can be difficult to understand. Sometimes you might encounter poems that are confrontational or difficult to analyze. So take that as a challenge and start a conversation with the poem. See if you agree with what the poem is saying or disagree. And the next section is talking back to the poem. Ask questions about the poem. Who's speaking? How is the form of the poem, so the structure of the poem, related to the content of the poem? Does the poem use imagery to achieve a particular effect? What is the title of the poem? How is it related to the content of the poem? These questions are really strong questions that can help you start to analyze the content and understand the poem in a more critical way and not just in a passive way, because we are looking critically at these poems and analytically. Below that, there is text and context. So the text itself is the poem, and then the context is the world around the poem. So I've given you some context for each poem in the slides that I provided. And then the last section says embrace ambiguity. You're not going to have the answers to every question that you have about a poem answered immediately. You will have to analyze deeply and think critically about these poems. You'll have to ask questions, and you might have ambiguous answers. There might be more than one interpretation of a poem. In fact, I think all of the poems in this unit could be interpreted in more than one way. So consider that when you're reading, and embrace the fact that you and another classmate could have two different readings of a poem, and those readings both still be valid. And that's it. So that page is not super long, but it is required reading. So make sure you get that resource read if you haven't already. The second link, like I said, is the Elements of Poetry slides, just like we have every unit. I'm not going to go over all of these because you can read them yourself, but these are the vocab words for this unit. So some old terms that we already know from fiction and drama, like theme and imagery. And then there's some new ones that we will be learning for this unit, like metaphor, allusion, simile. And then there's some discussion of the big trifecta that we call it in poetry, the trifecta of themes. Most poems can at least fall into one of these categories of having the theme of death, nature, or love. And that is because these are themes that are everlasting, right? Something that will always happen to a human being is they will always have some experience with love in their life. They will always experience nature in one way or another because we live in this big, beautiful world. And then they will, unfortunately, always experience a type of death, their own or someone they love, or someone in their life. And so because those three themes are everlasting in human nature and in our human experience, they are themes that appear in poetry repeatedly from the beginning of time, from the beginning of poetry itself till the last poem is written. They will be consistent. So a lot of the poems that we read for this unit will fall into at least one, if not all three of these categories. So keep an eye out for these themes. You'll certainly see them come up a lot. There's types of imagery, and imagery explained in one of the poems that we read. This talks about poetic structure, and understanding this is really important for when you are discussing the poems themselves in your essays. Make sure that you are using all of these terms correctly. It is one key signifier of an academic scholar for you to use your terms correctly. If you're using your terms incorrectly, then it's clear to your reader that you're not taking your study seriously, or that you are not familiar enough with your scholarship to be persuasive. This also discusses rhyme scheme. And there are some The third resource is a video, and it's called How to Annotate Poetry. It's a YouTube video. And I like this source because while it is about like a 13-minute long video, you can put it on 2x speed because it is a guy, a student, I believe, who is just annotating a poem as he goes along. And he shows how he would annotate a poem if he's just come across this poem for the first time. This is a great practice to start doing with all of the poems you read, especially the poems you're thinking about writing about for your essay, because annotating a poem can essentially create notes for yourself for the essay so that you can go back to those notes and come up with ideas for your body paragraphs without having to come up with those ideas on the fly every time you read the poem. Then below that, we have all the poems that you're required to read. So we have Passionate Shepherd, Nymph's Reply, The Raven, Nothing Gold Can Stay, Hope is the Thing with Feathers, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, Wild Geese, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, and those are the poems that we'll read for this unit. Those are required, all of them, so make sure to read all of them. There's also a poetry sample student essay below that I've included for you all to look at in hopes that you will get some ideas about how to structure your essay for this unit, because this unit's essay is going to be a compare and contrast essay. And so sometimes students struggle with how to structure those, right? And I've given you this sample essay as a kind of a template. You can mimic the structure of this essay if you enjoy the way that this essay is structured. Below that poetry sample student essay, we have the poetry quiz. It's just a quiz on the poems themselves, just like the previous quizzes. And then the discussion board is one of the only things that's kind of different this unit. It says, instead of our regular discussion board post where you discuss the poems we have read with your fellow classmates, this discussion board will function as a topic proposal workshop. First, read the poetry essay instructions under the poetry module tab in full. So read the thing below this, the poetry essay assignment instructions. Once you've done that, start brainstorming some topic ideas. For that essay, you'll be comparing two poems. You can compare their shared themes, their use of literary elements, or their figurative language. For this discussion board post, tell your peers what poems you are thinking of writing about and how you might compare those poems. If you are between a few ideas, feel free to tell the class whatever ideas you have. This way, when they respond, they can help you decide which one is stronger. This portion of the discussion board post should be at least 50 words. So it doesn't have to be a lengthy explanation of what you're writing about, but you should at least include what two poems you're thinking of comparing, and then what elements of those poems you're thinking of comparing. So for example, if I am doing this assignment, I might want to compare The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe and Nothing Gold Can Stay by Robert Frost. If those two poems are the things I'm going to compare, in my discussion board post, I might say, I'm thinking of comparing The Raven and Nothing Gold Can Stay. I'm thinking of comparing the elements of imagery and rhyme scheme in these two poems because they have similar levels of rhyme scheme, but their imagery is used differently, maybe. Those are just some basic ideas that I've come up with right now. The second portion of your grade for this discussion board is your response to your classmates, and this is equally important. You each must thoughtfully respond to at least one other student's topic proposal discussion post, but this is more important than your typical discussion board post reply. Give your classmates insightful ideas, not just great idea, go with that. How can they better compare the two poems they've chosen? What is your take on those poems? What are some elements you noticed? Check the slides in this section for a refresher on poetic literary elements if you haven't already. Also, try to avoid commenting on someone's post if they already have lots of replies. My hope is that everyone will get some peer review feedback on their topic ideas. So if this goes the way I hope it will go, everyone will post a topic proposal on the discussion board, and everyone will have at least one reply from a classmate giving that person some feedback on their topic idea. And make sure to give substantial feedback. Here's some things I think you could add to your comparison. Here is some things I would change about the idea you have, or this is a poem that I think would work better than the ones you have. Any advice that you think would be helpful, or any guiding ideas that you think might help your classmate. Obviously, you are not required as the author of your paper to change your ideas based on your classmates' recommendations, but it's always good to have a second set of eyes or a second brain on the topic, right? So work together on this. We are not working, this is not a competition, right? We are all writing different papers. So work together to come up with strong topics for everyone, and then we will all succeed together. That's always my thought. Okay, the last thing on the poetry unit is obviously our poetry essay. And I will go over the requirements for it now. So for this paper, you will choose two poems we've read in class. The only ones you're not allowed to choose together are The Passionate Shepherd, To His Love, and The Nymph's Reply. You can't choose those two poems together. You can choose one of those poems and another poem, but you can't choose those two together. The reason is because those two poems were written in conversation with each other. And that is made clear in the context slides. It's best to choose two poems on the same general topics, like romantic love, death, or family. Compare and contrast the two poems. Come to your own interpretation about how the poems are similar and or different. That means you can write a whole essay about how they're similar, you can write a whole essay about how they're different, or you can do a little bit of both. The best way to compare and contrast the poems themes, or use of poetic elements. This interpretation should be your thesis. While you do not have to identify every poetic element in each poem, use appropriate poetic terminology in your discussion. For example, if one poem is using a metaphor, you need to call it a metaphor. Don't just skip over the use of the technical terms. The essay should systematically explain the thesis statement, make sure paragraphs are unified and transitions smooth. As in any literature paper, support every point you make with specific and appropriate examples from the poems. This is one thing that I gave you some notes about from the fiction units. Essay, make sure to use direct quotes from the poems, especially with poetry. Direct quotes are going to be the thing that really helps you support your claims, because when we're talking about, metaphor and simile and rhyme scheme, you're not going to want to summarize something to point out that there's a rhyme, right? You're going to want to use the direct quote. So make sure to use direct quotes. Be sure to explain the evidence that you have included adequately. As in any literature paper, use MLA citations and edit it carefully. The completed essay should be 750 words or more and have a works cited page, even if you only need to cite the poems themselves. In fact, you only will need to cite the poems themselves, 2 poems. No outside research is allowed, and plagiarism or AI usage will not be tolerated. Your poetry discussion board will function as your topic proposal. There, please identify the poems you plan to use, or a few poems you're deciding between if you're still unsure, and the poetic elements you'll be comparing and contrasting. Make sure to go back to that discussion board also to see the feedback that you got from your classmates, because that will help you in your process, in your drafting process. The completed essay is due in the correct Dropbox on Brightspace. You can click on the assignment here itself to turn it in. If you have questions about the assignment, please email me. We can set up a meeting, or we can talk about it in the email. And then below that, I have some rubric items that I'm going to grade by. Most of them are very similar to the previous rubric items. So if you're familiar with those, it's going to be pretty similar to the previous one. So that is all for this video. I am going to go make a second video on the context for each poem, because I feel like those are better. Context is better given when it is discussed, vocally. So I'm going to give you that context in a video with some slides. So make sure to watch that video as well. But this was the informative video that I usually prepare. So I'll post this one for you, and then I will go ahead and post the lecture video with the context for the poetry, so that you can get some behind the scenes information on each poem and each author. All right, I'll see you in that video. Bye guys.